this is a completely black area for me. I don't know very much about HBCUs, and I think I'm just kind of excited for the opportunity to gain some insight and learn a bunch of information. Um, I feel like every time, whenever you learn, for me anyway, whenever I learn things, I have a bunch of conversations and then debates and all these things, and you'd be surprised at how much random disparate information ends up coming up and being particularly relevant. And I think I particularly specialize in like synthesis of information, so I'm like constantly pulling from different areas and different conversations, and so I'm excited for just even learning. I'm very infatuated with that.
Rad. Well, that's super awesome.
Yeah. So okay. Wow. Yeah, this is great. First off, how are you? How are you doing today?
Oh, doing well, doing well. It's the end of the semester over here, and I've got a ton of papers to grade coming in, and it's going to be its own set of excitement and adventure. But it's the calm before the storm right now.
I see. So the end of the semester is typically way more chaotic than the beginning or the middle. I see. Are you a person who thrives on the chaos, or do you prefer it when it's calm?
You know, that's a really interesting question. I think I'm just so used to chaos in teaching and whatnot, and feeling that inevitably there's always going to be a sense of chaos at the end of the semester. It makes for a kind of climactic feel for the semester overall. So yeah, no.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I thrive in chaos, and like 100%. I don't plan anything. I'm really, really terrible at like structure and organization and things like that. And so I learned recently that when things are more chaotic, I feel more alive, and I tend to rise to the occasion. But I know that it's not healthiest, you know what I mean? But it's just the way things are. So I've started to recognize other people that thrive on it. So then it's like, they want it to be kind of high energy and high strung, and they just, but then I've learned there's a lot of people who don't want it at all. They prefer everything be as planned and structured as possible. Are you more on that end of the spectrum? You prefer the planning stuff?
Well, I think to a certain extent, it's the nature of the job. We have to have at least some of it planned out. We have a syllabi, we have curriculum, we have stuff that we are working towards. But invariably, things do happen. And I like to think that I'm adaptable. And when you encounter chaos like that, you have to adapt to it. And I think that that's something that I can rise to occasions for. But yeah.
Makes sense. That's it. Okay. So, I mean, you work at an HBCU, and I don't know very much about HBCUs. I mean, I know that there was a point in time during segregation where black people weren't allowed to go to, they weren't allowed to go to white schools. And so then a few colleges were created specifically for black people. And so I think that's where HBCU comes from, to my knowledge.
Yeah. So with regards to the history of it, you see the creation of a lot of land grant institutions of higher learning and stuff like that came about in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War in some instances. So in some cases, I went to Morehouse College, and we got started we trace our origins back to 1867. So that's like 2 years after the Civil War. So these institutions, they have a storied and lengthy history, and for a good chunk of the time, they were the spaces for us to be able to go, these spaces where we were able to get the best quality education. And understanding that historically that's kind of been the case, there were roadblocks and impediments that sort of came about as even in these sort of spaces for black people to gain a critical mass of education and stuff like that. People just sort of shunted them off to other parts of the community, and you just had to make do. But yeah, no, that's sort of the point of genesis for a lot of these institutions. Yeah.
Okay, and so then I guess the question would be, now that segregation isn't, legal anymore and things like that, and you have, black people able to attend other universities, what would be the benefit to attending an HBCU? Why do they still exist?
So the perennial and evergreen green question of why do HBCUs still exist? I'm glad that you asked that, because I think that that's a question that ebbs and flows in terms of the popular discourse surrounding these institutions. I think that a really significant reason for why these institutions do persist and continue to exist is that they offer something that other institutions can't. You can go to a PWI and you can have your Black Student Union.
What's a PWI?
A primarily white institution. I'm sorry, you'll excuse me. Yeah,
it's okay. It's totally good.
We understand. HBCUs
I understood. I just wanted you to say it for the video.
For sure. Yeah. So if you go to a primarily white institution, you have your Black student unions. You have institutions that are set in place to sort of give Black folks a space where they can have a critical mass. Where they can come together and sort of share experiences and stuff like that. And you also have Black Greek organizations and other organizations and institutions that exist in those spaces that have historically been tied to Black experiences. But an HBCU, and historically Black college and university, is something that exists from the ground up, built specifically for that kind of experience. And yes, you can go anywhere and you can get any kind of education. And you can find institutions that are tailored more to your specific field or your specific interest or whatever. But I think, and I'll speak for myself, I can't speak for anybody and everybody else, but for me, one of the things that was a deciding factor in choosing to go to an HBCU was that I knew that I was going to be validated, challenged, and my lived experiences sort of given a special kind of recognition, and that's not the word I'm looking for.
Consideration?
Exactly. I think that that's much better, right? And as a professor at one of these institutions now, having crossed over and being on the other side of the line in that regard, I look at my students with a degree of understanding for the fact that they've come into this institution seeking something specific, a specific kind of consideration, and understanding that by coming here, excellence is not just something that is, it's not a surprise that you're excellent. Excellence is what got you in the door.
Right.
And as such, I'm going to hold you accountable for that baseline level of excellence in your core competency, because I've been where you've been. I know what your experiences are. And as such, I can be empathetic, I can be supportive, and I can challenge you in ways that I believe will fully help you to grow. And that's been the storied tradition of professors at these institutions, kind of going as far back as can be remembered.
That's really freaking awesome. There's a few things that stuck out from what you said, and I think one of them is about there not being a surprise at your excellence, because there can be, I would imagine, at some PWIs where people will look and almost look at you like, oh wow, I've heard this comment a lot where they say, oh, you're so well spoken for a Black person, you know what I mean, things like that. Whereas I would imagine that an HBCU, there's not this juxtaposition of you versus other people. You know what I mean? It's just we view you as an individual, as a person, and just see you for who you are and expect excellency.
Exactly, and that's the beautiful paradox of HBCUs. You get to be an individual, but also you get to be a part of a community.
It sounds great. Wow. Okay. So, I can see that being pretty valuable. I guess some people might say, well, obviously the segregation isn't a thing, and so you'll see that there are still Caucasian people, Hispanic people, Asian people, they attend HBCUs as well. I would imagine the numbers are significantly lower for them, but even still that they do attend. What is their reasoning typically for attending?
Well, unfortunately, I can't speak to what any individual's reasoning or rationale may be for that. it could be any number of things. It could be just the quality of the programs. The institution that I work at now is one that has has historically had a really, really strong pharmacy, nursing programs. I mean, it's really great. And it's, you come here because you're going to get a real good education for that specific field. So, I mean, that's something that exists irrespective of your racial background, irrespective of, some of the aspects of history that come with the historically Black college experience. So, I mean, that may be a reason for it. It may also be a reason for the fact that you just like the vibes. You want to come here because you want to learn something. You want to be a good ally. You want to be somebody who is immersed in a culture that you really can gain something from. And to be quite honest, I mean, there is very much a vibe here. Yeah. You look at a homecoming experience at an HBCU, and you look at one at a PWI, and it's a fundamentally different kind of beast.
Absolutely. Man, listen. Speaking of that, so I didn't go to an HBCU, and I went. Even in high school, I lived in a pretty Caucasian area, and so my band experience and things like that were very Caucasian, to put it, pretty plainly. And so I think the first time I saw even what that idea was, that there could be a difference in the way that people conduct themselves within band and within, the cheerleading and all of those things, I think was in the movie Drumline, actually, is where I saw some of like the way that the trumpets and things would move and dance and stuff as they're playing, and the brass section, the instruments, and just there was just a total different thing there that I still didn't associate this with HBCUs. It was just a thing. And then I can say it was Beyonce's Homecoming, when she did what was it called? There's a very, very big Coachella, and she had this production that was with like bands. It was like with a live band, brass and all of these things. And I saw that, and then was dating someone, actually engaged to someone, and she was explaining like how her mother, it was so important for her to get this HBCU experience and so on and so forth, and seeing that, and I started drawing this association of what that is, because it didn't click. I didn't understand how different and how cultural some of that stuff is. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's one of the beautiful secrets. It's one of the things that if you don't know, you don't know, and you miss out on. You can go your whole life without ever stopping to think about what actually goes on at halftime at an HBCU football game. Right. But if you do know, and you get a chance to go to it, you get a chance to experience, and you see that it is a show, it is a performance, it is a truly experience. And like, that's one of the coolest things about this. And like I say again, like, people go their whole lives without ever stopping to think about it. And it's not until we start making movies about it, until we start validating our own experiences, until we start appreciating the fact that we have a unique culture worth celebrating and recognizing and publicizing and shining a spotlight on also, that's how people start to realize that, man, there must be something really special at these places. And it's not just a matter of, well, they couldn't get in any place else, so they just got to go to the Black school or whatever, which is sometimes what I fear the thought process might be. But for some people outside of the Black community or whatever, even some people within the Black community might look at that, folks who go to HBCUs like that as well. But it's we come here because it is something that is magical. We come here because it is something that is, I mean, in a very real way, it's kind of a space dedicated towards our cultural and historical experience. Right. And when we get to showcase that, it just, I mean, who wouldn't want to?
Yeah. So there's I mean, you had mentioned earlier that like your school had a particularly good nursing program and things like that. So I think that is another myth sometimes, that people kind of have a perception that HBCUs have somewhat of an inferior standard. Is there any truth to that?
Well, from what I've seen, and I can only speak anecdotally, and so you take this with however big or small a grain of salt you care to, It does sometimes feel as though there is a kind of tacit kind of condescension towards our institutions from people external to them, where people don't know what we do. And because our stuff doesn't get recognized in the same way, because who would it benefit for our programs to get recognition or something like that, right? So I find that is a thing. That may also be why people, if they know anything about these institutions, it may be that they know about the band or step shows, or because they had that run of movies in the late aughts where it was Drumline and it was Stomp the Yard, and it was like these sorts of things. And that's kind of a storied tradition that goes back as far at least as School Days, the Spike Lee movie, and A Different World, the TV show. Right? There have been instances where people try to show what's going on at HBCUs, and when you present these things, you kind of have to show a balance of it. Do you show just the fun stuff? Do you show just the cultural experiences or stuff like that, or do you try to show the education that we're trying to provide here also?
Right.
Because it's hard to make a movie about college where you just see people going to class.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily make for super entertaining storytelling, I suppose. Anybody can make anything happen, but I think it would be cool if somebody tried, I suppose.
Listen, I even I can't imagine it being particularly entertaining, to be honest. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just, there has to be some sort of drama. I mean, even you look at things like not American Pie, but in any of those old movies from the 90s, it's never about the education. It's whatever drama is external to the education, But
Absolutely.
But yeah, there has to be that understanding, because I do think that there is that stigma attached to it, and I don't even know that the stigma is valid, But it's just in fact I don't believe it's valid, but it seems like that would be there. But I think some of that can just be, some sort of lingering. Lingering, maybe not racism, but just lingering negative attitudes about blackness, I would say. But yeah, I think speaking lastly to the band and the step shows and all of those things, I would say I think you're 100% right in that it is very much an experience, and I think Black people in general, we're particularly colorful, and maybe I should use the word flamboyant so that because we're not talking about the race thing. It's just culturally we've been so much more energetic, and that's just kind of how we are. And so you see it play out in band. You see it play out because again, we were very stiff. We would play our instruments, and it was just you played, you stood there, you stepped to your place you needed to go, step, stand, play. There was never any of that kind of movement or any of those things. And so I remember thinking, how are they playing? How do they stay in pitch? Doing that, because it's just not something practiced. It's a total different, again, experience. Sure. I think the music selection is entirely different. I think, man, it's insane to see people doing, Michael Jackson and just playing certain songs that resonate. I've seen bands doing Maze, that's just a different thing. So I think it's something that I would have appreciated greatly had I actually attended one of those. Yeah. So the other thing that I think is really important, maybe you can speak to this, is college isn't all about education. A humongous portion of the college experience is about networking. Tell me how HBCUs impact Black students in that way.
See, and again, this is another fascinating question and a super nuanced one, because I've heard a variation of a question like that in terms of like, how do you expect to sort of function in the real world if your experience is solely grounded in a fully Black space like this? And so how do you expect to network? How do you expect to make connections? How do you expect to do so on and so forth? But one of the great things about this is that, of course, like you say, college is not just about the educational elements. It's about, the organizations that you're a part of. If you are a part of a band at a particular institution and people know that that's the case, they'll recognize that and they'll be like, oh, okay, well, I'm gonna hook you up. I'll give you this access because I know you've had a similar kind of experience. And again, speaking as somebody who went to Morehouse in particular, the second somebody finds out you went to Morehouse, that you are a Morehouse man, like all of a sudden everything, just doors open up for you. And people really will try to hold you down in that regard. And it's a similar sort of a thing if you're a part of, and I can't speak specifically to this because I wasn't Greek, but what I've heard in terms of stories, like people who are part of those Divine Nine, those Greek organizations, the nine, historically Black fraternities and sororities, they definitely will do a lot to sort of help one another out. And that's kind of the cool thing about an HBCU in general. It's kind of like being a part of a giant fraternity or sorority. People that you see, when they recognize that, oh, okay, oh, you've had this kind of experience, let me see what I can do to try and, be accommodating for you, or to throw you a line or something like, or help you out a little bit, or mentor you a little bit too. Because again, everybody really, we know that we all rise when we all rise, right? And these institutions also really foster, as mentioned previously, that sense of community. So it's like, how can we really sort of build collective mindsets or community-oriented mindsets by pulling up the people who came behind us? And again, what's that, the expression? I forget what organization it's the slogan for, or lifting as we climb, right? Maybe that's the United Negro College Fund. I don't know. I don't want to misattribute or nothing like that. But right. Again, that's sort of the ethos. And I think that that's such a cool kind of thing, right? I mean, it's all about the kinds of connections that you could. I was walking around an airport wearing some paraphernalia from one of the HBCUs that I've been affiliated with, and somebody just saw me in it, and they were like, "Oh, yo, I went there." Or, I see that, or, class of such and such, right? And people love to just shout you out like that, because it's a weird way of making yourself very visible. And even if my father went to Howard and for med school, and, I rib him all the time because it's good-natured rivalry, because it's like, oh, well, yeah, you went to Howard, whatever. I mean, that's like a decent school, I suppose, but it's not Morehouse. But, we have these kinds of, it's like a sibling rivalry kind of a thing, because that the other school is another HBCU just like you. And so you want to validate them in their existence and stuff like that. But at the same time, somebody got to be the best. Right. And inevitably, Morehouse got to be the best, right? So.
Yeah. I think, so, man, and this is just be, my imagination here, and I don't know for sure that if there probably could be some data to back something up like that. But I know that for college graduates, I had a conversation with someone we were debating, and they were saying that they didn't like HBCUs because they felt that they were more expensive than their than whatever. And so I looked it up, and at the time, this was in 2021, I want to say. And at the time, HBCUs on average cost less than PWIs, actually. And furthermore, he was saying that they didn't provide as great of an opportunity for their graduates. And I think we looked up the data right then, and found that on average, HBCU grads made several $1,000s more a year than the PWI Black counterparts. And so I guess I would imagine, because, Black professionals exist in the real world, and I would imagine if you're going to an HBCU and developing that network, that Black people who have graduated from HBCUs, which are a lot more plentiful in the previous generations, would want to help specifically recruit people from HBCUs and things like that. So I would imagine that is what would cause that difference in opportunity. Because you hear a lot of horror stories about college graduates, Black college graduates who don't earn as much, who still have a much harder time finding opportunities. And so you'll find that a degree for Black people doesn't confer the same annual income as it does for white, the exact same degree as it does for Caucasians. And so I would imagine just being part of that divine line, being part of those experiences, having those mentors, having people who are professionals who are still giving back to the community and things like that would probably provide a little bit more opportunity. That's just my thought process.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that they again, it's speaking to the ethos. At graduation, one of the things that they kept trying to tell us was, now people will graduate from these institutions. I'm speaking anecdotally, of course. I don't have hard evidence to back this up, so you'll excuse me on this as well. But people will tell you, people will graduate from these schools and they don't give back. People don't give back to the institution that sort of helped make them who they are, and so on and so forth. And that's like a thing that they really try to impress upon us. And so, I lean very hard in the opposite direction. Even when I was a struggling grad student, I was like, let me send my little $5 back to Morehouse, because ain't nobody gonna say I didn't give back.
Right.
Because again, I want this opportunity to be available for somebody who came behind me. And there was, of course, that story. And I'm blanking on the gentleman's name, of course, which is really bad and maybe makes this case not as helpful as it might be. But this was just a couple of years ago, where Morehouse made a whole lot of headlines because there was a billionaire who came to give like a commencement address or something like that at graduation. He paid off everybody's student loans, like the whole graduating class.
That's crazy.
It is, yeah. And that's why it was such like, it made so much like shockwaves throughout the media sphere, because people were like, wow, this guy really just paid off everybody's student loans. And again, I'm sorry I don't have names or anything like that. And I'm sure a quick Google search, your audience might be able to sort of check this out. Maybe you might even be able to find it as well. But yeah, again, that desire to recognize the fact that we can help one another. And it's important. And I think that that's a big part of what these institutions really do strive, when they're at their very best, to be able to do.
Yeah, his name was Robert Smith.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, it's crazy. I didn't know that even existed.
Yeah. Now, I mean, graduating classes at these institutions are not as big as they are at Morehouse is a pretty small school or whatever, all things considered. But still though.
Yeah, I'm saying we're not downplaying this at all. I mean, college student loans they're a force. You know what I mean? They've been so much a part of the political discourse as it is now, and there's been so many people who have like kind of accepted even the notion that I'm going to go to college, and then these student loans will be with me for the rest of my life, while I'll just go ahead and continue and do my life kind of independent of them, and so on and so forth. Student loan debt at this point is, approaching levels that are like trillions and trillions of dollars at this point. It's absurd numbers. And so I mean, to do something like that, I think just gives so many people an advantage, because obviously even when it comes to like buying a home, one of the biggest factors is your debt to income ratio. So then if you get rid of what is, I would imagine for most of these people, their largest debt, right? Then, I mean, you immediately give them the ability to enter into the house buying market, which is what generates so much wealth. And so it's a transformative act there for every person that graduated in that situation. That is insane. Shout outs to Robert Smith for that. I just didn't want to let his name not be remembered, because that's crazy. Yeah, that's amazing. So here, I wanted to speak to some of the challenges or the obstacles that HBCUs kind of face in today's educational landscape. So first off, how do financial constraints impact the resources and the programs that are available at HBCUs?
Well, I mean, that is the perennial concern. How do you make sure that you, of course, as we've indicated, financial constraints are real problems for the students, and that they are the sort of focal point of a lot of the discourse. But in some instances, it's kind of hard to consider, how do we keep certain programs, certain departments at these institutions, and at really almost every institution? How do we keep them relevant, and how do we keep them existing? I will say that I'm an English professor, and you would think that all colleges would have English departments, but English departments, in terms of their ability to produce or ability to sort of help students think that you can get a degree or a marketable degree in English, is kind of a hard sell. And so that kind of also, how do we continue to make this department seem super valuable and like we're contributing something of merit to the institution? We're not in STEM. We're not in science and technology or so, and then these are the real sort of the fields that when people in administration see these fields, they see dollar signs. When they see English, nobody sees dollar signs. So that's a part of the discourse, I think, and that is kind of a challenge. But I think that that's kind of a challenge across the board for institutions. I mean, it's something that, you know, I feel acutely at this at HBCUs, of course, because that's the way that I see it. But I think honestly, kind of across the board, that's a concern.
Right. So I don't know much about it. I don't even know how they would determine. Are there schools where they don't have an English department? Like that would seem almost impossible. But
I mean, there's some schools that have English programs. And you know, again, that may not necessarily be just an HBCU. I mean, that might be like some of these technical schools or something like that. So I mean, there are institutions where it's not like you don't go to a tech school to major in English.
Right.
So it's kind of like a program there or something like that. But yeah, no, I mean.
Okay, and then what are some of the systemic barriers that HBCU encounters when it comes to funding and support and things like that?
I feel a little bit less equipped to be able to provide substantive context for that question than might be particularly helpful for the discourse here. So I'm gonna go ahead and apologize on the front end about that.
It's okay. For sure.
In terms of also not having, yeah.
I think so I really don't know much about. I mean, I guess schools get a lot of funding from the federal government. You know what I mean? And those kind of conversations have been had about different presidents slashing different numbers and so on and so forth. And so I've always heard recently, it feels like during the last presidential election and the upcoming one, it seems like now people are talking specifically about HBCUs when it comes to funding and presidential involvement. I think Trump took credit for something, but then something happened where they didn't end up getting the money. So I don't know very much about that. Are you more informed? It's more probably pertinent to you.
I mean, I remember that instance, and I remember the photo op associated with it, where you have all the presidents from these institutions. They all went to the White House or whatever, and everybody was supposed to be like, "Oh, well, this is a nice moment for us because we get to feel like we're getting something from, you know, this administration or whatever." And then everybody just ends up looking silly, I guess. Well, not necessarily looking silly, I suppose, but the situation just ends up being a little bit more complicated than people thought it might have been when some of the realities of that situation make themselves apparent.
Right.
So, yeah, you know, not a optimal situation for really anybody involved outside of the administration, one imagines, who gets their nice little photo op with a bunch of black folks.
Right. 100%. And here's one: how do HBCUs navigate issues of representation and diversity within their faculty and their administration?
So that's interesting. I can say that there are a lot of different kinds of folks on faculty across the welter of HBCUs that do exist. You have a lot of different kinds of folks from a lot of different backgrounds. Because that's kind of the nature of what the fields are. You know, again, in English, in my graduate program, I counted myself as kind of a rarity because I was one of the only black male doctoral candidates in English. There was like one other dude that was coming up behind me, and then after that, it was kind of sparse. Specifically focusing on literature. You know, we have people who focus a little bit more on rhetoric and composition at that particular institution, the graduate school I was at. But yeah, no, I mean, it's literature is a kind of not very prevalent. There's not a lot of prevalence of black male figures in that field, but you do see them, of course. So it creates a dynamic wherein if departments and colleges and whatnot are hiring folks, you're going to have to hire a diverse array of folks. Because I mean, if you'd like to hire black folks, do so. I mean, you'll find them, of course, but you know, you might have to cast a wide net. And so, you know, I've seen departments that have had, you know, a whole lot of white professors, a whole lot of professors of other backgrounds and stuff. Also, I think that it's always super helpful when you can provide for students representation of folk who look like them as their professors. I think that that means a lot. And that was something that I cherished a whole lot about my experience at Morehouse. I was in history back then. I got my bachelor's in history. But every time I looked at my professors, I was like, yo, they look just like me. And for whatever that was worth, you know, it was certainly a affirming kind of experience. So I looked at folks and I saw, okay, this is something that I could be doing eventually if I choose to go this route. But, you know, you always want to have a lot of different kinds of voices to hear from. You don't want to ever just create an echo chamber, one imagines, where everybody just looks like you and has had your exact experience, because then what can you really sort of teach me at that point, right?
Right.
And
I think that's part of it. As translatable to the real world, which you kind of touched on earlier, I would imagine.
Sure.
And then obviously the stigma attached with like the idea that it would be like discriminatory and we only allow black teachers and that kind of thing, that sounds awful. And then I would imagine we know this to be true, that people of varying backgrounds have like things to contribute, you know, and
of course.
And so I would imagine it's not going to be exclusive, but I do think that like you said, having some black teachers and things like that would be pretty beneficial, specifically because I think even like growing up, they've like, you just don't see a lot. Like having a black male teacher is extremely rare. I don't think I had one growing like all throughout my education. I never had one. Well, actually, there was one. I believe it was Mr. B.I. Rishengo. He was a history teacher for 7th grade, and his name stands out because he was an African man, and he was the only black male teacher I ever had. So, I mean, obviously we do need representation, but if once it becomes exclusive, it becomes something else entirely.
Exactly.
So, what role do HBCUs play in promoting social justice, racial equality, and activism?
That's a super fascinating question, right? Because historically, it's been kind of a more fraught answer than you might imagine, right? We might look at these institutions as being sort of the bastions for agitation, for progressive sentiments, and creating a critical mass of students to be able to go out into the world and change the world, right? But the reality, historically speaking, was sometimes a little bit different, because the institutions, they're just trying to exist. They're trying to be able to, and in many instances, to exist in the South, where there are whole other communities that are a part of the cities where these institutions are that don't particularly feel like they want to see that kind of change. So historically speaking, it was always a fine line to try and walk. How do you help students feel affirmed? How do you help them feel valued? How do you help them feel like they have a history worth fighting for, and that their existence is something that is worth recognizing and allowing space for in the communities that they exist in and decide to go out into? But by the same token, you have the specter of respectability. You know, we have to create students who are going to be role models and whatnot, and role models don't go out there and agitate or what have you. So it's a fine line to sort of try and walk. You want to inform people, but you also, do you want to inform them to the degree that they become, agitators, radicals, so on and so forth. And I think that the successes of HBCUs have been quite marked. And I keep coming back to my experiences at Morehouse, because that's where I was born again, one imagines. But I don't know whether you know this or not, or it's kind of a not well kept, it's not a secret or anything like that, but Martin Luther King went to Morehouse. And so that's a big part also of what the institution now trades on. We've got King's Chapel right there in the middle of campus. And that's a legacy that the school really tries to push. So we recognize the fact that we do have alumni from these institutions that have gone on to be precisely the kind of radical change makers that, push the needle, help bend the moral arc of the universe, as it were. And, you have not only just actual activists, but you have people who are artists and who write into existence narratives that fundamentally change the way that, establishments look at Black folks overall, right? I mean, we see connections to Howard for folks like Toni Morris and so on and so forth, right? So it's a big deal for these institutions to help serve as incubators for people who are going to effectuate real change and to create space for Black folks to exist in the broader American society. Now, in the contemporary moment, do we see that same kind of commitment towards incubating change makers? And I think so. On certain campuses, you do see people who are keyed in. You do see people who are aware of situations and who are activist minded and so on and so forth. That do push that push back against systems of white supremacy where and however they exist. So we definitely see that. Do the institutions actively advocate for that? Do they actually tell people to go out into the community and go be change makers? I mean, some people might say it would be nice if they would, but then other people recognize again, other people might control it. Exactly. So, it's always a complicated balancing act, I think.
I see. So considering that Martin Luther King went to Morehouse, was Morehouse pretty heavily involved in the civil rights movement or anything like that?
Well, funny you should ask, because not as much as you might think. You have again change makers who do come about here, but how much does popular discourse remember Atlanta itself as being a seabed for change? Morehouse is right in the middle of Atlanta, and still, do we see evidence of things like? And I mean, I'm not discounting anything that may have occurred there or anything like that. And I'm not a specialist in this particular aspect of history, but I mean, when we hear about changes, we hear about them in Montgomery or Selma or other places as well. Not so much in the spaces where you have like Tuskegee or Morehouse or Spelman or so on and so forth, right? So it's interesting to consider. And I think the institution recognized that King was doing something worth recognizing. By that point, of course, he had graduated. But it's also a matter of, do we come out and full-throatedly support this? I mean, because when King was making a lot of his agitations, not even other Black pastors could get online with everything that he was trying to accomplish.
Right.
So we recognize that too. I think the institution, of course, is proud of King now, and I think probably was proud of him to an extent at that point as well. But again, was Morehouse pushing people out the door and saying, "Go change the world"? Right. I'm not sure. I don't think so, though.
I mean, that's one of those things now. I've seen some posts online that really they stand out in my brain. And one of them was saying that a lot of you believe that you would have been on the side of Martin Luther King in the middle of the civil rights movement, and in truth, most of you wouldn't, because there was insane amounts of resistance. And what's even crazy is there was actually even a decent amount of resistance from other Black folks that wanted him not to make as many waves as he was. It's a really unpopular opinion to be the person that wants to change things. And a lot of times those people end up dying because it's extremely unpopular, and people tend to deal with unpopular people in certain ways. And so in history now, and in hindsight, we tend to venerate those individuals and say, oh, this was the amazing genius, so poignant and so intelligent and so on and so forth. But it's always in hindsight, because in the moment, there's still a fear. It's just there, where it's like, I would never advocate for people to do what they're doing. And it's like, I mean, I hear it, but then the change won't happen otherwise, And but I can understand like kind of the delicate situation, because I would imagine, I don't for a second believe that the vast majority of funding for HBCUs is coming strictly from Black people. So then I would imagine agitation can truly end your existence if certain people feel unmotivated to continue to support.
Exactly.
Yeah. So then the question becomes, how do we support HBCUs? And um, how would we help people to understand their need for existence, and just to generate awareness? How would you recommend individuals do that?
Mm, I think that that's a a big question,
Yes.
and so I'm going to try and address this maybe point by point. I think a big thing is to recognize that these institutions are valuable, to sort of have a sort of baseline level recognition across Black communities, to know that these institutions, historically Black colleges, have served amazing purposes and continue to serve amazing purposes. They are not an alternative in the sense that they're not a fallback. They are some places where we can aspire to. And until we start to recognize and value our own institutions, until we start to say that this can be people's first choice and that's not a bad thing, until we start to recognize the fact that these are things that we can celebrate as cultural touchstones, as all of the things that we've been discussing over the course of this interview, as we learn to recognize the fact that these places have value intrinsic to them. Until we start to do that, I mean, it's going to be hard to further advocate for their existence, because again, if we tell everybody else, yeah, well, I mean, these are nice things to have, but they just holdovers from, a darker moment in American history.
Mm-hmm.
Then people are going to say, well, why don't we just let them stay in that darker moment of American history? So I think it's been surprising, but the last 10 years, I think, have been quite significant in terms of like shining a spotlight. Well, really past 20 years. Honestly, I believe the bulk of this millennium so far has been an opportunity for folks to, again, recognize the significance of what HBCUs represent. And you see growing degrees of people sort of trying to appreciate their existence still. So, and I worry because I don't ever want to reduce anything to the obligation or the sort of the purview of pop culture. But I think pop culture really does have a big and significant part of, a role to play here. As we continue to tell stories about what HBCUs can represent. I mean, as you yourself sort of recognized, something like Drumline, that was a big deal. And, again, as we think back even further, a generation prior, something like A Different World, a big deal. These are the things that sort of help people to see, okay, well, yes, it can be cool to go to these places. You can have all kinds of experiences here. And, I think, again, the responsibility is to recognize the fact that you're not just going here just to play instruments or just to have step shows or whatever. The important thing is also to recognize that you go in there to learn, and you go in here to get a world-class education. But if you want to get people in the door, if you want to get people to recognize the fact that this is an option, showcasing it in mass media is a good way to do so. And also recognizing the fact that when we have major figures in the pop culture landscape who can be associated to these institutions. I mean, this is a little bit passé to say now because I don't know how relevant this person is, but I mean, you think about Common, the rapper Common. He went to FAMU and Florida A&M. He was there for a few minutes or whatever, but then he ended up going someplace else. But yeah, no, I mean, that's significant. You think about the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? Coates, he the writer of Between the World and Me, that major landmark text. He went to Howard. And you think about all of these people who have links back to these institutions. And when you see successful people and you see people who want to emulate their successes, a good way to do so is to affix them to an institution that might have helped launch them off.
Sure.
And it's not to say that they wouldn't have been successful had they gone anyplace else, but I think that that's a good way to do so.
Right.
So I don't know. I'm trying to think of ways that might be helpful to do so, and it perhaps might feel pie in the sky to say, leave it to pop culture. Pop culture will save us. But then again,
no, I think, listen, pop culture is what informs most people about most things. Pop culture is about popularism. And a lot of times, I mean, how else do you think things get into people's psyches? Media and movies and music and things like that are incredibly influential things. Hip hop culture I believe genuinely influences a lot of black culture, as opposed to the opposite. It used to be black culture informed hip hop, and now it feels like almost a caricature that has become hip hop has started to influence black culture, and sometimes negative ways, to be honest with you.
For sure,
Um,
for sure.
but I think, yeah, the idea that pop culture would be hugely influential and impactful in helping people to get a greater understanding of what HBCUs are and what they contribute and why they're beneficial sounds great. And to that end, then I would say Beyonce's Coachella thing
Yeah.
that's humongous, because I mean she's
Hmm.
probably the most influential artist of this generation that's alive
Hmm.
today, and I would think her choosing to highlight HBCU culture in that way, with all of her music, being the first woman to headline Coachella at this point, with one of the biggest stages in existence, and then to put HBCUs so prevalent there with the outfits and the bands and just all of it. I thought that was humongous for a person like me who is so largely uninformed about HBCUs. I think it gave me, once I was able to associate it, it was like, oh, that's what this is. Mike, this is huge. To date, I didn't know that A Different World was about HBCU. I hadn't even made that association. Sometimes I
Yeah,
can be a
yeah, yeah.
little weird and just not
No,
reasonable,
that's
but
okay.
yeah, I didn't see that. So I think even that's a huge deal, you know. And I would imagine for people, it's a little bit before my time, and also I grew up without television, so
Hmm.
but I would imagine there's probably a lot of people. There are probably people who made the choice to attend HBCU specifically from seeing that. So
Yeah,
I think all of those things are rather important. I think that makes a lot of sense, actually.
sure.
And you can't leave it all, but I mean that's still a hugely influential medium that probably should be explored. And I think the more people to do that, um, I think that would be largely beneficial. Um,
Yeah.
so then, corporations and organizations, how would they do it? Well, do they do a lot of scholarships and things like that for HBCUs, or how does that work?
Yeah, yeah, and I can speak specifically once again to my experience. Coca-Cola has a partnership with Morehouse, and they had the Coca-Cola pre-college leadership program at Morehouse that I was involved with, and so I was like, oh, okay, well that's a thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's Atlanta, so I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, the world of Coke is right there in the city as well. So yeah, I mean, there is lot to be said about business schools in general, but Morehouse Business School is pretty prestigious. And, it has a lot of connections and a whole lot of ways in which people sort of gain access that way. There are a whole lot of internships that are coordinated through that program and whatnot also. Um, I get a little leery about corporations kind of in general, of course, and the idea of corporations sort of having hands on these institutions feels like set up for a gift and a curse.
Mm-hmm.
Because when corporations, uh, what is it? They have the purse strings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then again, you sort of can mitigate certain things or whatever as a result of that. But again, they have deep pockets, so
Right.
it's a fine line to sort of try and walk. So I don't really have an answer to that question, unfortunately. It certainly seems I know that these corporations do um, contribute and whatnot, but as to how I personally feel about it, speaking just as me, I don't know. I don't know.
See, because I think about, all right, in Pride Month, you see a lot of corporations doing a lot. Like they'll do a lot towards different organizations and different civil rights groups and things like that, and they just promote a lot during those times. And so I would imagine maybe during Black History Month they could do the same. We'll be doing X amount of scholarships for different X amount of students going to X amount of
Yeah.
HBCUs and things like that. And I think that could be pretty beneficial. And I would imagine it wouldn't come with too many strings attached, but it would be a great
Mhm.
way of helping to promote those kinds of things. I think it would just take people from those institutions reaching out to the corporations to do that. I mean, Coca-Cola is, very, very, very lucrative company. I mean, the Coca-Cola, it's one of the S&P 500, so they're doing quite well. And I mean, the fact that they're doing that with Morehouse, I think that's great. I think it's one of the biggest companies in existence. So I mean, I think
Yeah,
for them to do something like that is huge, and I wish they would highlight that more, and at different times so that people are aware. And I think, I mean, who doesn't drink soda? So then I think
yeah,
that
for
just
sure.
that would help raise awareness and things like that.
I
Um,
like what you said about actually doing something tangible. The one thing that I worry is that if these corporations, because I remember corporations getting involved with Pride Month initially, and it just felt like they just changed their little logo on social media to a rainbow and
mhm.
just called it a wrap. Like, oh, we support. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, oh, yeah, but so that's what my concern is that
Mhm.
yeah we'll shout out a couple of HBCUs on our Twitter feed for a couple of weeks and then just call it a wrap, right? And I'm
Yeah.
like, but that's nice, but
Right.
I like what you were saying a lot more in terms of like tangible and active. And again, I suppose that was the nature of your question initially. Like, how can people actively do something like that?
Mhm.
A real genuine commitment like that means a whole lot more than just in 1867 Morehouse College was founded,
Right.
says whatever
Coca-Cola.
corporation. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because I think current generations are really becoming disenfranchised from a lot of the more performative actions, right? Like,
Yeah,
yeah, just changing the logo. Like people, the memes come every time you see it,
yeah.
where they'll
Hmm.
they'll, they'll show them and they'll say at the end of Pride Month, and it shows them like vomiting out a bunch of Skittles and things. There's a bunch of memes that like basically demonstrate
Yeah.
that people recognize that it's just during this month we're saying something, and then we're gone. And same with Black History Month. Just during
Hmm.
these, 28th, we're going to talk about the same individuals, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, and then we're just going to kind of dismiss everything after that. But I think
Hmm.
you create a long-lasting impact by creating a scholarship, which allows a person to actually attend the college.
Yeah.
That is a transform. Education is one of the three largest factors that creates long-term success in this country. So that is humongous. And then, of course, like you said, all of the networking opportunities present at HBCUs and the cultural experience and the validation and the consideration, all of those things are like largely important. So I would say that would be great. Um, this is the last question that I have prepared, and it's a very broad question. Uh, it's kind of a spicy one, but maybe you might be able to help. Uh,
Okay.
what steps can policymakers take to address the systemic challenges faced by HBCUs and to promote their long-term sustainability? Curveball question.
And yeah, no, I was expecting a different direction than that as we sort of wrapped up. But that I think I don't think I have a satisfactory answer for that question. I wish I was better equipped to be able to give you the specifics of how that might look in terms of like what specific policy steps could be taken. Because God knows, I mean, we can talk about again the and my knee jerk is to simply say, well, let's just show support. But what does support mean, right? How can we really sort of turn that into a tangible commitment? How can we really sort of demonstrate means by which we can like actually create change beyond just relying on whatever other means to sort of get information out there about these institutions? Because I mean, yeah, if you get people to know about these schools or whatever, that's nice. But how can you support the students when they get here? And how can you ensure that scaffolding and apparatus are in place to really sort of make sure that that education means something beyond just the fact that it affirms your sense of blackness, your sense of identity, and your sense of who you are holistically? I mean, yeah, that's nice. You can walk out of there with a great sense of, I'm black and this is what that means. But if you're walking into a world where systems are in place that dehumanize everybody in some way, shape, or form, I mean, you walk out with a degree, but you also walk out with, as we've stated, massive amounts of debt or something like that. That creates another kind of paradigm where it's like, okay, well, I feel good about myself in one way, but I don't feel really good about myself in a whole bunch of other ways.
Right.
So, I again, I wonder. Well, I can say one thing. Well, I know we need space to be able to do our thing, right? So I think also about what's happening down in Florida, right? The way that You have people who are passing laws that are designed to really sort of create problems for people who are just trying to teach. And so I think that that's certainly problematic, to say the absolute least.
Right.
We can't have people actively seeking to undermine educational practices and stuff like that. That's certainly a step in the wrong direction policy-wise. But I feel so bad because this feels so anticlimactic in terms of our what has otherwise been a really awesome conversation. I've definitely enjoyed this, but I don't feel like I'm really in a space to offer you a really meaningful answer about how policies could be put in place to really sort of effectuate that kind of like systemic support or something like that. And I apologize for that, but
don't apologize. And it's not anticlimactic. And I think for several reasons. One, it's very rare that you run into people who are willing to admit that they don't have a solid answer. And I'd much, much, much prefer that you say, hey, this is just not an area where I feel particularly confident. Rather than you just try your best to say something that doesn't actually make a bunch of sense, that doesn't actually work. And you know what I mean? And I think every time you mention something that you don't have a specific answer for, it gives everyone, myself, you, and everyone listening, the opportunity to say, this is something we should look into. It highlights an area of something that can be researched, something that can be studied, that something that can be learned. Because oftentimes you don't know what you don't know. And so in this situation, here's something that I don't know, and now I know I don't know it, and so now I know this is something I can shore up. And so it's not anticlimactic. That we get to end with, I think everyone should research and figure out what policies can be made to like ensure the longevity of HBCUs and to help them. And then we get to do research upon doing so to figure out what previous presidents and previous like chambers of Congress have done to create longevity within the HBCUs. How have they supported them previously? And so then we can say we can repeat some of those things, because I would imagine there's been steps where people have made progress towards HBCUs and in places where they've been more regressive, you know? And so I think this is a great area of study now. So I sincerely appreciate your time in that regard. And actually, I do have one more question. This one isn't prepared, and I can ask that, and then that can be probably the final one. What would you say is your favorite experience from Morehouse?
Oh man, there were a whole lot of them. It was such a magical time in my life, and I'm going to be so honest and so earnest and to just simply say that. I will say graduation definitely was a big part of like what made that experience so wonderful. But I'll say that even more, the experiences of going through new student orientation as a freshman, getting brought into this community, getting brought into that sense of brotherhood, knowing that for the next 4 or so odd years, I was going to be a part of a family, something unique in the entirety of the world. Like that was just such a wonderful experience. And so I think overall, the overall sense of community was something that I cherished deeply. But new student orientation and graduation, the beginning and the end of the experience, those two bookends of just feeling like I'm going to be something, that's just such a wonderful kind of thing.
I'm sorry, if I could ask you just a few more things. I realized it'd be kind of remiss not to ask. What made you choose an HBCU as opposed to a PWI, you personally?
So the answer for that is pretty simple and straightforward. I went to a mostly white high school, and I had been in a mostly white middle school before that also. And, you know, it was what it was. It was an interesting kind of experience, but I knew it had to be more to it than that. And I was really into history also at the time. And I really wanted to know more about like Black history, and I wanted to know more about African history, and I wanted to know more about, you know, defining identity against prevailing notions of Eurocentrism. Like that's something I really wanted to push back against. And so I was like, okay, well, let me, what's going to be the best place for me to get that experience? So I said, what better place than where Martin Luther King went? So that was a big part of the thought process.
Wow. And so you chose Morehouse, or you targeted Morehouse, and then you were accepted, and so then that's where you ended up going. Was it a crazy culture shock, considering what your middle school and high school had been?
Yes, and I'll tell you why exactly. And I have a very specific reason why. And as you might imagine, I'm a pretty nerdy guy. So I was big into anime as a kid or whatever. And like that was something that always made me feel like a lot of the white folks around me didn't really know exactly what to do with, because stereotypes about what black guys are supposed to be, you know, whatever it is now, it wasn't that earlier in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me to really feel like, okay, well, I'm black, I do like to play sports, but I also really like this anime stuff. It felt super isolating, because even the other black folks at my high school, the couple, 2, 3 of them that there were, they didn't really know what anyone have any desire to be any part of that. But when I got to Morehouse, and that wasn't just recognized, but that was celebrated. Like I was the cool kid because I came to Morehouse with the anime DVD collection. People wanted to borrow my DVDs. I was like, this is bizarre.
Yeah.
And then, you know, having experiences also with my teammates on the track and field team, where we would just like hang out and stream early episodes of Naruto or whatever. Like that was a big part of that binding kind of moment. And I was just like, man, I feel so seen right now. And that was one of the coolest things about the experience. So sorry.
No, that's great.
I'm waxing nostalgic, I suppose.
100%. But that, I mean, it's perfect. But listen, I'm very much a nerd myself. And I think you can, when you're surrounded by certain environments where you get a lot of experiences with the, what do you call them? I guess prejudices. You develop certain prejudices about how black people are, and then you feel almost like isolated and like, oh, I'm different in some degree, right? And I think for me personally, I think when I started encountering like variety of more black people as I got older, and you know, besides my family, you know, which I think all of us were pretty nerdy in certain ways. But I think, encountering that, I think it sort of, it normalizes you and humanizes yourself to some degree to say, hey, no, this is part of the black experience, you know what I mean? As opposed to feeling like this is an ostracizing experience, you know what I mean? So I can imagine that being particularly gratifying. That's awesome. If you could do it all over again, would you choose PWI?
Oh no, definitely not. And I got a 4-year-old son right now, right? And I didn't set out to do this, but it kind of was like he's like a fish in water, right? So I've got all kind of Morehouse stuff all over the house or whatever. So one point fairly recently, once my little boy got to the point where he could start talking really well, he said, "Daddy, when I grow up, I'm going to be a scientist at Morehouse College." Apropos of almost nothing. And I was like, okay, all right. I love it.
Man, that has to be the best feeling on the planet. I can only imagine. And it's not even about, man, environment shapes young minds in so many ways that you're not even aware. They're just picking things up and normalizing things. I remember someone saying, it's a different topic, but I remember someone saying that it was a guy who was talking about divorce, and he said, we just don't realize how much it impacts young people. And he mentioned a 6-year-old who said, when I get married and I get divorced, I'm going to pay my child support on time. And it's just like, this is something he internalized from the negativity of his parents' relationship and the things that his mother was expressing and so on and so forth. And so in the same sense, I would imagine you being an educator, a teacher, and having, like you said, the paraphernalia around one, he already has it in his brain. He's going to go to college at 4 years old. That impact is humongous. That means he's already internalized the value of education. So that's huge. He wants to go to an HBCU, another huge thing. You know what I mean? Just I congratulate you. I know that had to have been one of the most validating and amazing experiences to see that. I think once you have children, they become the most important thing in the world, and that means you've already started doing a fantastic job. So I salute you and appreciate you for that. And again, I sincerely appreciate you being willing to have the conversation. Sorry I missed the very first date. I'm terrible with time and schedules and things like that. And I'm glad we were able to make this happen.
Definitely.
Yeah, maybe we'll have another conversation again. I'll probably do more research, and then I'll be able to have better questions, and then we'll have answers for some of the things that we didn't have answers for this time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you for your patience as I sort of rambled through some answers, but I love the opportunity to talk about this kind of stuff. This is something that's very near and dear to my heart.
For sure.
So me, I even having just met you, I'm sure you know that if you give me an inch, I'm just going to run off with it. So
100%.
definitely thank you for giving me that platform to be able to do so.
Absolutely, man. I look forward to talking to you in the future.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Wonderful to meet you.
You too. Peace.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. That was great. I enjoyed that conversation very, very much. Like I said, every conversation leads towards information that will come up in future conversations. You just have no idea how much you don't know about certain topics. And now I do want to look. It's ironic that we had this conversation today because on my Twitter feed, someone just recently made the statement. We were talking about Ice Cube's platinum plan. Contract with Black America versus Trump's platinum plan, and someone was saying, "Oh, yeah, you still like the drip Democrats." And Biden, in his first hour in office, ended the funding that Trump was giving to HBCUs. He was funding them for the next 10 years. But then someone else on the comment said, yeah, but they never got any of that money, and it was actually just more of a sham, and so on and so forth. And I don't know anything about that. So then having that referenced in this conversation, it's like, that's 2 times now. Someone mentioned that thing, and now this person mentioned about how those people went there for a photo op, but it didn't end up being what they, kind of expected, and seems kind of almost like they might have been fleeced, was what he was implying. He didn't use those words, but so now that gives me something that I want to research. I'm kind of excited about that.